For every Back to the Future, there was Mac and Me. For every Blade Runner, there was the Garbage Pail Kids movie. The 1980s gave us some of the greatest and not so great movies of all time. But what about the ones that could have been all-time 80s classics but just weren't? What about the movies that, for whatever reason, just didn't click? Movies with big production, top directors, great stories, and some of the biggest stars of the decade. Whether it was bad timing, too much competition, or the wrong type of promotion, some movies from the 80s just don't have the name power as some of the classics. And maybe they should. I'm Jamie Logie, and this is Everything 80s, a podcast that looks back on a decade that forever changed the way we dress, consume, and connected. Today, we revisit some movies you may have forgotten about, maybe were completely unaware of, or you saw them and loved them. This is 10 Forgotten Movies from the 80s. We begin with a film that, even though it wasn't the first to do so, it was the second. In 1984, Red Dawn, starring Patrick Swayze, was given the distinction of being the very first film with the new PG-13 rating. This new rating, which according to Statista is the most lucrative MPAA rating, changed the course of filmmaking. With this perfectly in-the-middle rating, movies could go more intense than PG without having to go fully R-rated, which limited screenings and younger viewers. Red Dawn was the first, but the second film to get the new PG-13 rating came out less than a week later. A movie called Dreamscape.
Dennis Quaid, Kate Capshaw, Dreamscape. When you close your eyes, the adventure begins.
Dreamscape is about Alex, a psychic with the ability to enter people's dreams. Recruited by a government research program, Alex ends up being tasked with exploring the dreams of others, specifically those plagued by recurring nightmares. This even includes the president, who is having nightmares about nuclear war. As Alex delves deeper into the dream world, he discovers a sinister plot to use dreams as a weapon for political assassination. Now he has to race against time to navigate through the treacherous dream landscapes to stop the plot and save innocent lives. Starring Dennis Quaid, Christopher Plummer, and even George Wendt, Dreamscape is a bit of Nightmare on Elm Street, a bit of Inception, a sprinkling of The Matrix, a little of The Upside Down from Stranger Things, and even a touch of Indiana Jones. The movie posters for Dreamscape even look quite similar to Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Temple of Doom posters. But that makes sense considering those were already two of the most successful movies ever. It's also interesting as it was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which was so intense and graphic that it led to the creation of the PG-13 rating. Dreamscape even features Kate Capshaw, who was married to Steven Spielberg and played Willie Scott, the singer in The Temple of Doom. Dreamscape also features a young boy, creating a similar dynamic to Indiana, Willie, and Short Round from The Temple of Doom. Speaking of Kate Capshaw, we will see her again a little later on in the show in a movie that suffered from some of the worst timing in film history. Dreamscape combines fantasy and horror, and even features what, at the time, were pretty good special effects. But, unfortunately, Dreamscape came out in the summer of 1984, meaning it had to go up against all-time classics like Ghostbusters, The Karate Kid, Purple Rain, Gremlins, and Revenge of the Nerds. Like many of the films we'll cover today, Dreamscape wasn't a blockbuster, but doubled its $6 million budget to bring in around $12 million at the box office. So, not a financial disaster, but not a runaway hit. Dreamscape explored some interesting dream-based subconscious ideas that we saw play out in A Nightmare on Elm Street, which would come out a few months later, and up to modern films like The Matrix and Inception. Next, we jump to the year 1985 and a romantic drama starring Matthew Modine and Linda Florentino called Vision Quest. Vision Quest is a coming-of-age story about a high school wrestler who falls in love with an older artist. According to Box Office Mojo, by the mid-80s, comedies were the highest grossing movie genre, and dramas were the second highest grossing. Vision Quest took advantage of the highly lucrative dramatic genre. And not only that, arguably the most popular artist of the time contributed music to the soundtrack. She also appears in the film. Along with the song Gambler, Madonna contributes one of her biggest songs ever for Vision Quest, Crazy for You. Madonna was so big at the time that it seemed as if Vision Quest could be a breakout hit. The star power of Madonna was so big that if you grew up in Europe or Australia during this time, you may know Vision Quest by the name Crazy for You. This was a way to capitalize on Madonna and take the movie to a wider audience. Released in February 1985, Vision Quest didn't have as much competition compared to if it had been released during the blockbuster summer movie season of 1985. However, Vision Quest still had to contend with Beverly Hills Cop. And then there was another coming-of-age, era-defining film released on the same day, The Breakfast Club. Vision Quest pulled in around $13 million. Again, far from a flop, but not a breakout hit. Did The Breakfast Club have something to do with this? Possibly. According to Box Office Mojo, the John Hughes classic brought in nearly $46 million and was the must-see movie of early 1985. We'll stay in the same time frame with a film that came out a few months before Vision Quest. This unique movie is directed by John Carpenter and combines several genres of film, including science fiction, romance, and drama. It starred Jeff Bridges and Karen Allen, who you would know as Marion Ravenwood from Raiders of the Lost Ark.
So far to come, so much to do, so little time to fall in love. Look up, company's coming. John Carpenter's Starman.
Starman is the story of an alien planet that intercepts the Voyager 2 space probe. The probe has a gold phonograph record with a message inviting any alien civilizations to Earth. One of those aliens takes up that invite, comes to Earth, and takes on the form of a human. He has traveled from a galaxy far beyond our own. He is 100,000 years ahead of us. He had powers we can't comprehend. And he is about to face the one force in the universe he has yet to conquer: love. That was the tagline to the movie that looked to have a lot of things going in its favor. John Carpenter had made his mark on Hollywood and was coming off huge films like Halloween, Escape from New York, Christine, and The Thing. Jeff Bridges and Karen Allen put in great performances, and the movie features amazing visuals and cinematography. Starman also had an interesting origin. According to IMDb, back in the early 80s, the script was being made for Columbia Pictures. And right at the same time, another script was being developed for another movie featuring an extraterrestrial. The studio didn't want to make two alien movies, so chose Starman and passed on the other script that went to another studio. That script turned out to be the movie that took down Star Wars to become the highest grossing film in history, E.T. Starman is science fiction, but still dramatic and romantic. It's also a bit of a road movie. There aren't a lot of films that can pull off multiple genres like this. But were people unsure of what to expect? Was it pure science fiction or pure fantasy? How dramatic and romantic was it? Was it a more grown-up E.T.? In his 1984 review, Roger Ebert gave it a thumbs up and called it one of the year's more touching love stories. He also praised the performance of Jeff Bridges. But did this turn away John Carpenter fans hoping for something more horror-based and intense? Were fans of romance hesitant knowing it was a John Carpenter film? Audiences still came out for Starman, but against a budget of around $24 million, it brought in just under $29 million. Considering the cost of marketing and promotion, it's hard to tell if Starman even broke even. But Starman remains one of those underrated 1980s sci-fi gems. Take a few big-name performers and throw them into a zany summer hijinks movie, and in the 1980s, you usually had a pretty good hit on your hands. Whether it was Weekend at Bernie's, Back to School, Revenge of the Nerds, or Summer School, the 80s had several examples, including our next entry, One Crazy Summer. This film is all about an aspiring cartoonist, and he and his friends try to come together in aid of a singer who is trying to save the family property from developers. Released in August 1986, One Crazy Summer stars John Cusack, Demi Moore, and Bobcat Goldthwait. If you grew up in the 80s, you know how popular Bobcat was becoming. From appearing in a video with Twisted Sister to the Police Academy movies, he was a part of the crew of zany performers like Weird Al Yankovic and Yahoo Serious. If you know those words but that name makes no sense, Yahoo Serious is an Australian performer who appeared in 1988's Young Einstein. With his unique voice and delivery, the marketing for One Crazy Summer centered around Bobcat Goldthwait. But One Crazy Summer had a big uphill battle to face because of the competition during the summer of 1986. It's a summer I've covered a lot on this podcast and features movies like The Karate Kid Part 2, Top Gun, the aforementioned Back to School, which was a gigantic hit and the third highest grossing film of the summer. There was also Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, The Fly, Flight of the Navigator, Howard the Duck, Labyrinth, and The Transformers the Movie. There are two other films that also come out around the same time, and we'll cover those in a bit. A movie like One Crazy Summer was perfect for the 1980s summer movie season, but with so much competition, it pulled in around $13 million against a budget of $9 million. Did the movie Back to School starring Rodney Dangerfield dominate the attention of the wacky hijinks summer movie crowd? Possibly, as it brought in an astonishing $91 million. That's over $250 million when adjusted for inflation. And with Ferris Bueller's Day Off still going strong with another $70 million at the box office, competition was fierce. Next, we have a movie that, for kids of the 80s, could have been one of the all-time greats. It starred Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix in their first movie roles and was directed by Joe Dante, the director of Gremlins. Released in the summer of 1985, Explorers is a science fantasy film about two teenagers who build their own spacecraft with the goal of exploring space.
They were just like everyone else. They dreamed of going to the stars. But unlike everyone else,
what's going on here?
They discovered a way to get there.
With the tagline, "The adventure begins in your own backyard," Explorers seem tailor-made to an audience that loved things like Star Wars, The Never-Ending Story, and Gremlins. In a decade where NASA and the space shuttle had captured everyone's imaginations, Explorers looked to have all the elements to make it a big hit with a new generation. Explorers featured science fiction, space, computers, aliens, and some pretty great special effects for the time. But it just didn't break through. And like many of these films, there are some pretty significant reasons why. The first, according to the Wrap, is that Explorers wasn't even properly finished before it was released. Not only was there a rush to get it out, but Joe Dante was also being pushed to make a follow-up to Gremlins. Along with this, Explorers wasn't even properly supported with advertising. Next, Explorers opened on July 12, 1985. And if you know your 1980s history, you know this is a significant date. This is the weekend of one of the biggest events of the 80s and of all time, Live Aid. I have a previous episode all about Live Aid and the astonishing concert featuring the biggest performers of the day. Live Aid was broadcast to more than 100 countries, and CNN estimates that 1.8 billion people were watching. So they weren't as likely to be at the movies. For Explorers, there was another issue. Opening just over a week before was a little time travel movie starring Michael J. Fox. Back to the Future not only dominated the summer movie season, but was the highest grossing film of 1985. Not only was Back to the Future drawing in a crowd that probably would have liked Explorers, but so was another movie that is a cornerstone of the 1980s, Goonies. Goonies was released just a month before Explorers. And if those two weren't enough, the 1985 summer movie season also included Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome, National Lampoon's European Vacation, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Weird Science, and Teen Wolf. Add to that the re-releases of E.T. and Ghostbusters, which between the two made another $50 million at the box office. Something had to give. And against a budget of over $20 million, Explorers managed just under $10 million in revenue. This is a movie still embraced by those who love it, but it just didn't reach that wider audience. Our next entry is one that feels like it could have been an all-time 1980s sci-fi classic. Not only did it star Tom Selleck, Kirstie Alley, and even Gene Simmons, but it was written and directed by Michael Crichton. Before he brought us Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton created the 1984 movie Runaway. Runaway combines science fiction and action, and it's about a police officer who has to track down dangerous robots while dealing with a scientist trying to cash in by manipulating those robots. Runaway is set in the then fictional year of 1991 and has some elements of Blade Runner and RoboCop. This movie is all about the future, technology, robotics, and even features drones. Just as important as the visual imagery and Michael Crichton is that Runaway stars Tom Selleck, who, thanks to Magnum PI, was one of the hottest stars of the time. Going into the release of Runaway, Magnum PI had become the third most watched show on TV and was still in the top 10 the year the movie came out. But Runaway didn't even manage to make back its budget. One of the reasons may be that Runaway was released in mid-December 1984. During the holiday season, a movie like this may not have been everyone's first choice if they were heading to the movies. And just a few weeks before Runaway came the re-release of A Christmas Story. There was another problem. At the start of December came the release of the biggest movie of 1984, Beverly Hills Cop. And another problem. Just a few months before Runaway came out came the release of a movie that also featured the future, robots, and another gigantic actor, James Cameron's The Terminator. Now we switch gears back to a comedy, and we go back to the summer of 1986 to a movie that was released around the same time as One Crazy Summer. So what do you get when you take one of the best comedic actors of all time with two other big-time performers to create a movie featuring action and comedy? You get Armed and Dangerous. Starring Meg Ryan, Eugene Levy, and the great John Candy, Armed and Dangerous is about a fired police officer and a useless lawyer that team up together as security guards. But little do they know, they've joined a corrupt union. This is the movie that you may remember the trailer of, which showed John Candy riding a motorcycle and knocking off the open door of a car. Something I still think about to this day every time I open my car door. Armed and Dangerous also features Tito Puente, James Tolkien, who played Mr. Strickland in Back to the Future, and Jonathan Banks, Mike from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. The combination of John Candy and Eugene Levy seemed like it was a match made in comedy heaven. But issues plagued the film. According to IMDb, the executive producer was Harold Ramis, who was not only Spengler in Ghostbusters, but brought us all-time classics like Caddyshack, Groundhog Day, Animal House, and National Lampoon's Vacation. Ramis was apparently unhappy with the final edit of Armed and Dangerous and asked to have his name removed from both the producer and screenwriter credits. Ramis was still billed as screenwriter, and in an interview with the AV Club, he called it a project that died a quiet death and needed to be resurrected. And if you remember from earlier, this is also the summer of 1986 and some of the biggest competition of the decade. But Armed and Dangerous still held its head above water, bringing in around $16 million at the box office. That was around $4 million more than its budget of $12 million. Armed and Dangerous also marks the beginning of a 10-film run for John Candy that was followed by Little Shop of Horrors, Spaceballs, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, She's Having a Baby, The Great Outdoors, Hot to Trot, Who's Harry Crumb, Speed Zone, and Uncle Buck. Next, we have a movie that looked to perfectly combine several variables into something that was hopefully a big hit. This next movie is a Western with a remarkable cast and produced and directed by Lawrence Kasdan, who was involved in writing The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Silverado is one of those rare movies on this list that was relatively successful financially, but not necessarily as well known as other big movies from the 80s. Silverado is a classic Western-style film about a group of misfits who band together to fight the injustices of the small town they live in. Silverado stars Kevin Costner, Danny Glover, Kevin Kline, Brian Dennehy, Rosanna Arquette, John Cleese, and Jeff Goldblum. Released in that highly competitive summer of 1985, Silverado was generally well received and made around $32 million on a relatively large budget of $24 million. It was even nominated for 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Sound and one for Best Original Score. For our second last entry, we go all the way back to 1981, in a movie that features some big-name performers and was actually a box office hit. But it may be a new one for you. The Four Seasons is a romantic comedy starring Alan Alda and the great Carol Burnett. This is a movie about 3 couples that live in New York. The 3 couples go on vacation together every 4 months, and we see them in spring, summer, autumn, and winter, hence the name of the movie. The Four Seasons also incorporates compositions by Vivaldi and was a critical and box office hit. The lower budget film pulled in over $50 million at the box office, or around $170 million adjusted for inflation. This put The Four Seasons in the top 10 highest grossing films of 1981, trailing behind well-known hits like For Your Eyes Only, Cannonball Run, Chariots of Fire, On Golden Pond, Superman 2, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Even though it came out a while ago and might not be as well known as its contemporaries, The Four Seasons continues to make an impact. As of the time of this recording, Tina Fey is set to be the lead of a Netflix series based on the film, with Steve Carell apparently also appearing alongside her. And we finish with the movie I covered a while back in a previous episode. It's the movie that had to deal with horrific timing and became one of the biggest marketing nightmares of the entire decade, and maybe in movie history.
An impossible mistake launched them into space. The adventure of their lives will be getting back home. Space Camp.
Space Camp is a movie about a group of young space camp attendees who accidentally get launched into space aboard the space shuttle. It stars Kate Capshaw, who we saw earlier in Dreamscape, Kelly Preston, Tom Skerritt from Top Gun, a young Joaquin Phoenix in his first film but credited as Leaf Phoenix, and fresh off of Back to the Future the year prior, Leah Thompson. Space Camp was to be the family-friendly science fiction action-adventure of the summer. Think Goonies in space. With great effects and a partnership with NASA, Space Camp even featured music composed by the legendary John Williams. The movie was finished in 1985 with a set release date of June 6 of 1986. But if you know your history, you know what happened less than 5 months earlier. An entire nation and the world was in shock over what had just happened with the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. Most notably upset were kids, as this was the first mission to space to feature a regular citizen, school teacher Krista McAuliffe. This was such a big event that schools all over tuned into the launch only to see it end in disaster. And now, you have a movie featuring a bunch of kids and their female teacher accidentally launched into space on the space shuttle who have to survive and get back home alive. As mentioned, the timing was nothing short of horrific and an absolute marketing nightmare. In his 1986 review, Roger Ebert stated how Space Camp had everything going against it. Quote, "The time is not right for a comedy thriller about a bunch of kids who are accidentally shot into orbit with their female teacher. It may never be right again, unquote. He also mentioned how our memories regarding the space shuttle are so painful that space camp was doomed even before it begins. As delicate as the marketing tried to be, for a majority of the public, it was just too soon, even though space camp was completed before the Challenger disaster. And then the Tampa Bay Times reported that the footage of the shuttle landing at the end of space camp also happened to be real footage of the Challenger from 1983. It was unfortunate, as this was going to be the perfect summer movie for young people. It had some big-name stars and came with the tagline, "The Adventure of the Summer." Space Camp was also going to time perfectly with what was supposed to be a huge event and giant success with a teacher in space. This movie could help get a new generation of kids further interested in not just NASA and space, but science too. It's hard to tell how Space Camp would have gone over without the Challenger disaster. It could have been another Flight of the Navigator, or Adventures in Babysitting in Space, or, as I mentioned earlier, like Goonies in space. But for obvious reasons, it wasn't able to reach a vast audience. There are so many movies from the 80s that fell below the radar, and this is just a small sampling. Other lesser-known films include things like Death Trap, the black comedy mystery suspense film starring Christopher Reeve and Michael Caine. There is the movie After Hours, the comedy directed by Martin Scorsese starring Catherine O'Hara and John Hurd, aka Mr. and Mrs. McAllister from Home Alone, Bronson Pinchot, aka Balky from Perfect Strangers, Rosanna Arquette, Terry Garr, and Cheech Marin. There is also Night Shift, another bizarre comedy from 1982, and one of the first big movies directed by Ron Howard. Night Shift starred as still Fonzie-esque Henry Winkler, Shelley Long, a young Kevin Costner, a brief appearance by a younger Shannon Doherty, and in one of his first few movie roles, Michael Keaton. There are just so many movies like this, and you may have your own favorites that aren't necessarily household names. These films all faced various issues, especially for films released in the first half of the 80s. A lot of the TV shows and movies of the early 80s were disposable content. They came and went and could be easily forgotten about. This was great for a TV show or movie that was a train wreck, but not so great for something that was genuinely good. In the early 80s, if you put out something bad, it was disposable and no one would ever see it again. Things could come and quickly go. Now, everything lives forever online. And the flip side of this is tough too. If you made something great back then that just didn't break through, there was the risk it too could disappear forever. With the VCR not as commonplace in the early 80s, it meant fewer and fewer people could record something to check it out later. And with home video slowly growing but nowhere near the level it would be in the second half of the decade, finding renters was difficult for a movie that didn't necessarily have a recognizable name like Raiders of the Lost Ark or Gremlins. Some of your favorite unknown movies ever might not have even had a home video release until decades later. For a forgotten movie, being discovered as a cult classic was a way for it to at least have some longevity. Getting an airing on network TV was even more unlikely for a film without much demand behind it. Then there was another big issue that plagued so many forgotten movies: the limited amount of screens. Back in the 80s, my city had one theater with 6 screens, one with 4, a couple with 2, and a few singles. I figured that there were about 14 to 16 screens in my city. Today, with some of the big multiplexes, my city has 41 screens, and that's not including independent theaters and drive-ins. Back in the 80s, films just opened on far fewer screens than today, giving them less of a chance to get in front of more eyes. Take a movie like Starman from 1984. According to Box Office Mojo, Starman opened in just 1,261 theaters in the US. And during its widest release, that number went up by just 10 theaters. Compare that to Avengers Endgame, which opened on nearly 4,700 screens. With high competition and screen time at a premium, it was just tougher for some of these movies to get showings, especially during the most popular times of the day. If the public demand in 1984 went through the roof for movies like Gremlins, The Karate Kid, and Ghostbusters, a film like Dreamscape probably wasn't going to get too many showings. Some of the movies we've covered today you may have loved, never heard of, or have now triggered a memory because you forgot all about them. Not everything can be a hit, and during a time of big competition, way fewer screens and showings than we have today, or being able to quickly show up and move between streaming platforms, some films in the 80s just couldn't break through. But sometimes it's nice to have your own favorite films that feel like they're just yours. The ones that aren't big blockbuster mainstream hits that always come up when discussing 1980s movies. The forgotten, underappreciated, or just unknown releases remain special in their own right. So that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this episode, there's plenty more where that came from, so be sure to check out my earlier episodes to take a trip back in time. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Everything 80s podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss out on new episodes. If you love 1980s movies, you might want to check out the Everything 80s movie review podcast over at patreon.com. That's where I review the good, the bad, and the ugly of 1980s movies. If you want to take a closer look, you can just head on over to patreon.com/80s. That's patreon.com/80s, or click on the link in the description. So thank you again so much for joining me here today. Whether this is your first time listening or you've been here since the beginning and you know who you are, I can't thank you enough. So I'm Jamie. This has been Everything 80s, but I'll be back soon with a new episode. Don't you dare miss it.